Hey everyone, welcome back to the show. This is your host, Dr. Kappas, and today I'm joined by my guest, Dr. Karla Mehlenbacher. Thank you for joining me today.
Hi, thank you for having me.
Of course. Dr. Mehlenbacher, you practice in Austin, Texas, is that correct?
Yes, I just moved back almost 2 years ago now.
Great. And I always like to ask when we first start these shows, how did you get so interested in neurology? And just to preface, today our episode is going to be about the vagus nerve. So I'm really excited to talk about that. But how about a little bit about you first?
Yeah, my story is kind of a roundabout. It was not a direct connection, which I'm sure most people in our field is a similar story. I was pre-med biology major, and then I got sick with what now I know is Hashimoto's. I had severe POTS, positional orthostatic tachycardia syndrome. So for people that don't know what that is, basically I would like black out easily and not be able to regulate my temperature. Still at the time had no idea what was really going on with my nervous system. Totally switched gears because of this to chiropractic school, which I didn't even know what chiropractors did. And then I got there and found more people that do things like functional medicine and functional neurology, Dr. Malilo and Dr. Carrick, and people that were doing these motor sensory integration for people like me with POTS, and just got super obsessed and blown away by how much we can utilize the sensory input and motor input to enhance our nervous system. So kept going. I now have my fellowship in mild traumatic brain injury and vestibular rehab through the Carrick Institute, as well as childhood neurodevelopmental disorders with Dr. Robert Malilo.
Awesome.
Yeah.
So you're definitely someone qualified to talk about this topic today, for sure. People may be familiar, may have heard the word vagus nerve thrown around before, but let's pretend that no one has ever heard that word before. Can you tell us a little bit about what it exactly is?
Yeah, it's definitely getting talked about a lot. I even hear it like in yoga class, and people that I'm like, how do you even know what that is?
Yeah.
But in general, for people that have no idea, it's basically the parasympathetic branch of the autonomic nervous system. So classically, we've been told we're either in a state of fight or flight, which is sympathetic, or we're in a state of rest digest, which is parasympathetic. And the vagus nerve has been known to be the wandering nerve, or one of the largest nerves. It's really starts in the same nucleus and branches off into a bunch of different nerves. But it's been known to be the main controller of that rest digest parasympathetic system. Mm-hmm. So it's the complicated part of it is that it's now we're learning more and more about what actually makes us go into rest digest, and it's not as like black and white as we initially used to describe it, or even how they do describe it in yoga and therapy. It's still kind of oversimplified.
Mm-hmm. It's a very complex nerve, right? You said it was the wandering nerve. How far exactly does it wander? Like how far is its reach actually?
Yeah, it goes all to our internal organs or our visceral organs. So everything that's below the diaphragm, basically, that we don't have automatic control over. It's more of like reflexive control. So basically everything that makes us get blood flow to those organs that let us digest and breed and heal and repair our system. The opposite being blood flow is going to my limbs because I'm ready to move or be challenged or survive. And then we need that shut off phase of like, okay, now it's time to heal. Mm-hmm. So it's a huge nerve, and the polyvagal theory portion of it is now connecting the nerves above our from our neck up. So social relating ways of feeling safe, which is kind of a new conversation. It's been, a lot of people have talked about the below the diaphragm gut function, leaky gut, the gut-brain connection. You hear it everywhere now, but then the added layer that polyvagal theory is now introduced is this above the neck social engagement, social regulation, and that's what we're finding has kind of been the missing piece of the conversation for a while now.
Okay, so interesting. So how how do those two relate then? How does the polyvagal theory, I guess, make sense from that standpoint?
Yeah, so the big picture, this was all theorized by Dr. Stephen Porges since only the 90s, really. So it's still even being talked about in literature. You're not going to find a whole lot about it. It is now finally being discussed, but basically we now know that the actual nerve nucleus has two different main components. One is the dorsal motor and one's a ventral nucleus. So the ventral portion being the part that's above the neck above, so being able to self-regulate with others. To kind of give like the way I like to explain it to my patients is really it's the science of feeling safe. So in order for us to go into a place of healing and breathing and digestion, we have to feel safe enough to put our guard down, put that fight or flight system at bay for a moment to push blood to those areas. So if you think of it like a pyramid, the very bottom foundation of the pyramid is below our diaphragm. It's our microbiome, it's our gut health, it's what we're eating, it's all of that. The second layer of the pyramid is this mobilization, right? Do I have motor control? And this is where things like primitive reflexes are talked about, and being able to defy gravity and understand and perceive motion and gravity. And then the top of the pyramid, because we're human and tribal creatures, is actually having connection and feeling safe with others. And that's what makes us ultimately feel the safest to heal and survive.
Mm-hmm.
So sorry, do you want to say?
Go ahead.
I was going to say the three ways that I always describe it as like our initial, as an adult, right? I'm talking about fully developed brains. We have our first level of safety is like assessing the social level. Like, do you make me feel safe by your movement, by your tone of voice, by your facial expressions? So our heart rate will either raise or lower based off of how safe I feel with others. Dogs are very obvious about this, right? They sniff each other for like a whole minute. They're like, are you cool or not? And then they decide whether or not they'll relax. So let's say you don't feel safe. And this is really big with kids and development, is like they can't actually mobilize out of the situation, which is the second phase of feeling safe. So let's say I don't feel safe in the situation. Maybe it's vestibular, which is what we talk about a lot. Maybe it's from eye movement, whatever it is, I don't feel safe up here. So now I'm in fight or flight, or now I'm in challenge. So not necessarily a bad thing. It just means like, hey, I need to get out of the situation or move my body. Something's not right. And then the third layer is below the diaphragm, which is where we'll actually disassociate or freeze, which is a reptilian reflex, which is kind of like if you're held gunpoint and you lose your bowels. So it's the most primitive reflex to say, I'm just going to shut off then. So this is where it all goes back to reflexes, gross motor, fine motor, complex thought, and emotion. Mm-hmm. And it has to kind of go in that order of level of safety, which is why us as functional neurologists talk about reflexes and gross motor control and fine motor control so much, because it's like the bottom of the pyramid of feeling safe.
Mm-hmm. So then you as a practitioner, how do you then appease that top part of the pyramid and allow people to feel safe and appease that social aspect of the vagus nerve?
I love that question. I mean, I think the problem is a lot of people immediately go to that part, and they go to like a psychotherapist, and they're like, and of course those things are huge, but if you're missing the bottom of the pyramid, I always say start with the bottom of the pyramid, start with your physiology, start with your overall sense of safety. And then when we are at the top of the pyramid, there are tons of exercises you can do to begin challenging it, like making facial expressions in the mirror, using voice exercises, humming, gargling. We all talk about using deep throat muscles, doing things like with a functional neurologist where you actually work with your eyes and your inner ear to perceive, like ADHD is a big one. And a lot of people don't really know how to explain what's going on in the brain with ADHD. Stephen Porges' theory is that it's your brain is not able to tune out the low frequency predatorial sounds to tune into a high frequency voice. So this is all still in this last top of the pyramid. So is it that kid really just can't pay attention, or is it because he can't tune out low frequency sounds to be able to tune into the high frequency human voice.
Mm-hmm.
So there's so much about this top part of the pyramid that is on a super basic level, it's having relationships and community, but then as functional neurologists, you can get more specific with how are you perceiving vision, how are you perceiving sound, how are you perceiving light, all of that is still this top part of the pyramid.
Mm-hmm. Okay, very interesting.
Yeah.
So with a nerve so far-reaching and so kind of general, so to say, as the vagus nerve, a lot of different things it can control. How do you actually assess for that then in the office? Like, how do you know that the vagus nerve might be a problem?
Yeah, this is the only neuroscience approved, literature approved, agreeing measurement is heart rate variability. And for people that aren't familiar with heart rate variability, basically when our heart rate is not able to, if we're not able to control the extreme variabilities of it, then we say you have low heart rate variability, right? You can't handle moving from one position to the other quickly or regulating blood flow to your gut quickly versus someone that has high heart rate variability. They have a lot of resiliency, I think is a good word. That's one really, well, especially everyone wearing the Fitbits and the iPhones, like you can always measure where you're at from that level. From clinicians' perspective, and this is something that's also not approved in literature, but we're discussing is primitive reflexes. So there's a lot of arguments about what exactly primitive reflexes are. Stephen Porges' comment and mine as well, and the more I learn and dig into this, is that they are signs of the autonomic nervous system. It's a reflex of the autonomic nervous system, whether it be spinal related or vestibular related. So checking primitive reflexes is something you can do at home. If you don't know how to do it, I have video resources. There's a lot of video resources online, but these are just windows into the nervous system to say, why did your body go immediately into fight or flight when we did this thing? So example is like the grasping reflex. If you ever grab a baby, they'll hold on tight. Well, if you scrape your hand and you still have this kind of reflex, and we know when a baby develops and they can hold their head up and their own body up, then they drop this reflex because they don't need it anymore. Initially, they needed it to stay alive and survive. But then once they feel safe enough to hold themselves upright, they drop the reflex and move on to the next motor skill. So if we see these types, there's over 40 different primitive reflexes. If we see these types of things, we say, why is your nervous system immediately going into this sympathetic response versus having control over it? Then the third layer is microbiome. Is your physiology not safe? Are you inflamed? Do you have an infection? So all three of those are really powerful things that anyone can start to do to self-assess themselves at home and say, like, hey, this might be off for me.
Yeah. And this is a topic that we've definitely touched on in previous episodes, but hearing you talk about, how far-reaching the vagus nerve is and the different components of our, I guess, humanism that it contributes to, it stands to reason that, the gut-brain axis that we hear so much about makes sense, as well as kind of when the gut's off, anxiety we could start to have more anxiety, depression, things like that, and vice versa. How do those two things play? You've definitely touched on it a little bit so far, but.
Yeah, I mean, it's the bottom of our microbiome is the bottom of the pyramid, if the pyramid is a good analogy, because it's the first thing that's needed for survival. Complex thought and emotion are unfortunately not needed for survival. They're needed for optimization. So when something goes off, let's say we get an infection or have some sort of inflammation, then the first thing to start losing blood flow is the top of the pyramid. And then the focus goes back to am I safe in my own body right now? Am I safe in my environment? So when it could be the opposite, right? The chicken or the egg. Like, let's say you were really stressed you went through a divorce or moved across country or whatever it is that was really stressful. That reflex was set. So going back to the gunpoint example, you went right to a shut off state, depending on what it was. Let's say you lost someone that meant a lot to you. Your body will actually lose blood flow to those organs, not permanently, but the more chronic that stress goes, then it does start to create actual leaky gut, right? The tight junctions are tight because of the nervous system, not because
Mhm.
of anything else, right? The nervous system is what keeps them together. So it's like, is it the chicken or the egg? It could have truly been a pathogen, or it could have been that you let yourself become opportunistic and susceptible.
Mhm. And you brought up the example of, someone holding a gun to your head, or, I know we've had other people have given examples of like a tiger or something. That's what we're typically used to, those kind of stressors in life,
Mhm.
those kind of acute stressors. But in daily life, for most people now, we don't really get held up at gunpoint every day, or we don't, get attacked by bears, but we have other kind of more chronic stressors, right?
Mhm.
So how do those things like deadlines or work stress, things like that, how do those affect the vagus nerve and that interaction?
Yeah, because most of us, even if it's not a gunpoint or even a tiger, you even turn on the news and you're like,
Yeah.
oh wow, world is ending, like
Yeah.
what are we gonna do? So it is, even though we don't physically experience it necessarily directly in front of us, we're still mentally creating that lack of blood flow and shutting off feeling of like, all I can do is shut off right now. So I would say things that you can actively do is intentionally create time for your rest digest. If you don't get good sleep, if you don't have all these things, then that's a sign that the system is off.
Mhm.
So making sure that you shut off all these stimulating triggers, or if it is, I know it's like easier said than done, but if you hate your job and you get stressed every time, then maybe you need a new job. Uh, if you're constantly putting yourself in an environment where you're eating poor food and bad nutrition, like look at those things seriously and say, am I really letting my body go into rest digest, or am I constantly putting it into a state of fight or flight and survival?
Yeah.
So that's more of the chronic things, and the more chronic it is, the more like layered it becomes with
Hmm.
a variety of different reasons.
Hmm. Yeah. And if somebody or if you determine, or if someone feels like this is an issue in their life, what are some easy ways that we can actually activate the vagus nerve or start to control it, improve it, things of that nature?
Yeah, so I have a whole laundry list of ways. So for there's different ways for the dorsal motor, and then different ways for the vagus, the ventral vagus. So dorsal motor is more like the gut-brain connection, right? So below the diaphragm. So making sure your gut microbiome you're eating the right foods, that you don't have any sort of pathogen that's causing this increase in fight or flight and survival. And then for the ventral vagus, this is where it goes into like, you can do cold on the place, right? The dive reflex, you could do ocular pressure, you can do carotid pressure, you can do the insulfation, or like the acupuncture point in the ear. You can make facial expressions in the mirror, scheduled social time. Like especially if you're one of those people that just doesn't do it or has extreme social anxiety, slowly starting to do it in a place where you feel safe, but knowing like if I don't actively get in front of someone, it's not the same even as a video, right? Because you
Hmm.
can't feel my vibration, you can't see all those micro movements. So there still is like a less sense of safety. So really looking at your relationships in your life, and that even goes back to like childhood relationships and what programs you have now, but this is like the more newer concept that Stephen Porge brought to the table that wasn't really discussed, and just how much even we know every study that's been done on humans that are put into isolation, they will go manic and die,
Hmm.
right? So we're not meant to be alone. So really looking at your life in that way and saying, do I have good friendships, people that are really there for me, my ride or die team? And then all of those other functional neurology tools like the ice and the humming and the vibration. If anyone really wants, I can provide the list. I have like a free download for that.
Yeah, I mean, that would be great if you wanted to give us your website link or
Yeah, I'll
anything like
definitely
that.
put that up.
Awesome. So that's interesting, the whole social aspect of the vagus nerve. Um,
Mhm.
are there studies that you found that specifically link um, I mean, you said the isolation in prison and things like that, but is there any link between being introverted and extroverted to, your vagus nerve integrity?
I haven't seen anything about that in particular, mostly because the introverted extroverted thing, at least from what I've seen, I haven't seen it on any sort of neuroanatomy perspective on like one side is more introverted, one maybe the right left brain thing, maybe, but because one is more big picture and risk taking and one is more internal. So my theory on that, and this is totally a theory because none of this is like set in stone, my theory on that goes to we are living in a predominantly left brain dopamine reward driven society, and to feel really safe is our right brain connection to others. So on that level, I would say feed the right brain as much as you can. I do believe, I don't know if there's like direct studies to prove this, but we know with autism, ADHD, a lot of these patterns, people that have social inhibitions, they often have this right brain weakness. And that's not, again, this has been argued, but there is still a lot of correlation and a lot of studies that show this social connection, internal reflection is more of that right insular side, which feeds that right basal ganglia, which is why we have like a tipping point to that direction. That's the theory that, yeah.
And I know, piggybacking kind of off of that, but sort of redirecting, I know that socialization is very important as we age. Individuals who are more socially engaged tend to age better cognitively and from a standpoint of happiness. Is there any other relationship between the vagus nerve and aging, or the vagus nerve and like maybe degenerative diseases that we develop over time?
Yeah, I mean, the biggest study ever done, or longest study ever done on humans out of Harvard was that their conclusion was the people that had the most health, the most success were people that had healthy relationships, not money or fame or any of that. But one of the most scientifically recognized things is the ACE score, which is the adverse childhood experiences. So it's not, your question was about aging and degeneration style, but this actually is more from the childhood. They say with these 10 adverse childhood experiences that are listed, and I can also provide a link for that too, things like divorce or moving or witnessing a death or witnessing abuse or being a part of abuse. So if you've had 3 to 4 adverse childhood experiences, you're 70 to 80% more likely to have a chronic disease. So I don't know it from an adult perspective, but from the child perspective, we do have a lot of valid research saying kids that do not feel safe, whether it's from nutrition, or whether it's from infection, whether it's truly from a social safety, then they're dramatically more likely to have a chronic illness later on in life. And the theory is because of this mechanism.
Yeah, that's a great point. That's a great point and very true. Yeah, which brings us kind of back to like you were talking about the primitive reflexes and exactly. So Dr. Mehlenbacher, if people wanted to reach out directly to you or to find your clinic, how would they go about doing that?
So my website is takerootcn, charlienancy.com. My Instagram is at Dr. Karla Mehlenbacher. Those are the 2 easiest ways. My email is on the website as well, so shooting me an email also works. I am in the middle of having a whole primitive reflex self-paced course for people to be able to just download and do themselves. So that should be available very soon as well.
Cool.
And then looking to do a polyvagal theory webinar soon as well. So if you reach out on email or website, then I'm happy to provide that information for you guys.
Awesome. And that I'll be found at takerootcn.com.
Yep.
Okay, great. And are there any final thoughts that you had on the vagus nerve before we sign off today? I think we touched on a lot.
Yeah, I mean, I think the biggest take home is that it all goes back to feeling safe. And I think our idea of safety has maybe needs to be relooked at on,
Yeah.
and really getting to the bottom of like, how can we be in a safe place to heal and repair all of these ailments that we're in. So I do believe that this is a epidemic of an issue that's not really being looked at. Everyone feels anxious, but no one knows what to do or why or how to
Mhm.
stop it, you know? And there's a lot of really basic ways that you can make your body feel safe and decrease that extreme reaction.
Yeah. And I think the past year and a half, we're going to have a lot of people who
Yeah,
need some vagus nerve TLC coming up.
100%.
Yeah.
Even before last year, but yeah, it just made it even worse. Yeah.
hmm but I wanted to thank you again for coming on and sharing your expertise with us today, Dr. Mehlenbacher. This was fantastic. This is going to be very clarifying for a lot of people who are probably being bombarded with the word vagus nerve and have no idea what it actually means. So you can share this
Yeah.
with your yoga instructor. And
Right. I know. Thank you so much for having me. I am working on having like an actual educational video for people to be able to download that explains this, you know, with my brain poster and everything. So it's
Mhm.
more specific and in depth. But yeah, I'm really grateful to keep spreading this message and this knowledge for people to not feel like it's hopeless and they have no control, because there's so much you can do to help regulate your nervous system.
Right, exactly. Well, thank you
Mhm.
for all the work you do. And thank you again
Yeah,
for the
thank you.
podcast. This has been your host from the Neuro Wellness Podcast. Be well.